My name is Mariam. I never believed in fairy tales, but Adeel changed that, or so I thought. We met on a drizzly February evening at a university alumni mixer. I had dragged myself there reluctantly, thinking it would be nothing more than small talk and stale snacks. Then he approached me, tall, well-dressed, with a calm voice that carried warmth. He wasn't trying to impress me, and maybe that's what drew me in. While others asked what I did for work, he asked what I wanted to write about. That night, we ended up sitting on the rooftop alone, the city lights behind us, trading stories like old friends. I told him about my dream to publish a book of short stories. He listened, not like someone waiting to speak, but someone truly hearing me. It had been a long time since anyone made me feel seen like that. In the weeks that followed, Adeel became a constant in my life. He sent morning voice notes quoting poets I loved, remembered the smallest details about my preferences, and even mailed me a signed copy of a rare novel I once mentioned in passing. He worked as a software engineer, always calm under pressure, and never boastful about his success. With him, everything felt effortless, like we were always meant to find each other in this sprawling, distracted world. We weren't perfect, of course. He was more logical, I more emotional. But the contrast balanced us. Where I brought passion, he brought patience. Where I dreamed wildly, he grounded me. There were nights we stayed on the phone past midnight, discussing everything from childhood regrets to the color of stars. 2 months into our relationship, he introduced me to his sister and mother, both of whom welcomed me warmly. He talked openly about a future together, our travels, shared home, even the names of our future children. I should have felt joy. And I did. But buried beneath that joy was something I didn't want to name. Unease. Maybe it was how fast everything was moving. Maybe it was the way he occasionally turned quiet, as if retreating into himself, unreachable for hours. I'd brush it off, convincing myself I was overthinking things. After all, he hadn't done anything wrong. Still, something inside me wanted to slow down. But every time I tried, his tenderness would disarm me. One evening, under fairy lights on his rooftop, he pulled out a simple ring. No flash, just sincerity, and asked me to be his forever. Said yes. That night, we held hands in silence, the city below us, our lives seemingly coming together. But even as I leaned my head on his shoulder, a quiet voice whispered in my mind, "What if this perfect beginning is just the calm before a storm?" After the engagement, things moved quickly. Adeel got promoted and shifted into a spacious apartment on the quiet end of town. He insisted I help him set it up. It felt natural, like we were rehearsing for a life already promised. In that new space, our dynamic shifted. We spent longer evenings together, cooking, laughing, sometimes sitting in silence as music hummed softly in the background. The atmosphere was intimate, warm, but it also invited something we hadn't yet faced. The tension of physical closeness. One evening, after sharing too much wine and too many glances, we found ourselves standing too close in the kitchen. He kissed me, gently at first, then with urgency. The affection was real, but the pace was wrong. I hesitated, just a second too long, and in that tiny hesitation, something clumsy, careless happened. In his eagerness, in his rush, he misread my body's signals. What followed was a moment that felt both accidental and jarring. He had unintentionally crossed a line, not violently, not cruelly, but carelessly. He apologized instantly, pulling away. His voice panicked but confused. I thought you were okay," he said, looking at me like a stranger. "I didn't mean." I nodded, unable to speak. My body wasn't hurt, but my trust had been bruised. It wasn't the physical discomfort that lingered. It was the emotional dissonance. How could someone so thoughtful, so tuned in, be so off in that moment? The days that followed were strange. He didn't bring it up again and I didn't ask. But he grew distant. The sweet messages became short replies. The spontaneous calls stopped. He began using work as an excuse to avoid plans. When I asked if everything was all right, he smiled. But the smile didn't reach his eyes. Something had shifted. And worse, something inside me had changed too. I began questioning everything. Was his affection genuine? Or had I mistaken attention for intention? I wanted to believe in the man who brought me poetry books and remembered my favorite flower. But now, every quiet moment between us felt like a test I was failing. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't cold. He was simply absent. Present in form, absent in feeling. One night, I stood at his apartment window, watching the rain tap gently on the glass. He sat on the couch behind me, scrolling his phone, indifferent to the silence between us. And in that moment I realized something painful. It wasn't the mistake that created the distance. It was the fact that he never tried to mend it. The silence between us stretched like a widening crack in glass, fine at first, then impossible to ignore. Adeel wasn't cruel, just increasingly unavailable. Days would pass with short, vague messages. Busy at work, he'd say. Deadlines piling up. I told myself not to overthink, that this was just a phase. But intuition, when ignored, becomes louder. One evening, while scrolling through Instagram stories, I saw a mutual friend post a boomerang from a trendy downtown restaurant. In the background, barely in frame, was Adeel, laughing. Across the table sat a woman I didn't recognize. Her hand was extended mid-toast. His was raised too. I stared at the screen, my breath caught somewhere between my chest and throat. The next day, I asked him about it, casually, trying not to sound accusatory. He blinked once, twice, then shrugged. That was Hira. Coworker. It was just dinner, team thing. You're overthinking again. Again. That word hit me harder than it should have. He said it often now, like a shield to dismiss my concerns. I wanted to believe him. But my heart had started storing receipts. The following week, he left his tablet at my place. While charging it, a message flashed on the lock screen. Hira. Last night was amazing. Still smiling thinking about it. My hand trembled as I unlocked the device. What I found wasn't just flirtation, it was connection. Long, thoughtful exchanges. Photos. Inside jokes. Memes only couples share. He had been building a parallel world with someone else, piece by piece, while I stood waiting in the ruins of our own. When I confronted him, he didn't deny it. Instead, he sighed, as if exhausted by the effort of explanation. I didn't mean for it to happen, he said. Things between us, they've felt off for a while. Since when? Asked, my voice brittle. He paused. Since that night, in the kitchen. After what happened. Changed. You pulled away. I stared at him in disbelief. I changed. You made a mistake, and instead of facing it, you disappeared into someone else. He didn't respond. He didn't even look sorry, just quiet. As if the man who once wrote me letters no longer existed. In that moment, the grief wasn't just about betrayal. It was about losing someone who had once felt like home. And realizing that maybe, just maybe, he never truly was. As I walked out of his apartment, I didn't cry. Not yet. The tears would come later. For now, all I could feel was the strange weightlessness of truth. And the days that followed, I didn't reach out. And neither did he. The silence between us now felt final, not empty. I deleted the messages, unfollowed him, and returned the ring, quietly by courier. There was no need for grand exits. Some goodbyes come not with fireworks, but with folded clothes and unanswered questions. But the pain was real. At night I would lie awake, not crying, but remembering. I remembered the rooftop where he first asked me about my writing, the little bookstore where we found our first shared novel, and the balcony where I once imagined we'd raise a family. Each memory was now edged with hurt, like a beautiful photo slowly burning at the corners. Still, something inside me shifted. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want explanations. I wanted healing. So I turned inward. I went back to my journals, poured out the words that had been trapped by silence. I started writing stories again, not about him, not directly, but about women who broke, healed, and stood taller after. One of those stories got published on a local blog. The editor called it raw and quietly powerful. I smiled when I read that. Quiet power was all I had left, and maybe all I needed. Months passed. The seasons changed. I stopped checking his profile. Stopped wondering if he was still with her. It didn't matter anymore. Closure, I learned, isn't something someone else gives you. Something you grow into, like strength. One evening, as spring folded into summer, I attended a small book launch. I wore a simple blue dress and brought a copy of my first printed story. As I stepped into the quiet bookstore, I felt lighter, like I'd finally put down something too heavy to carry. Across the room, a stranger smiled at me. He looked nothing like Adeel, and that's what comforted me most. He didn't carry his memory. He wasn't a replacement. He was just a gentle reminder. Life still had stories left to write. As I left the bookstore, the night air felt warm, forgiving. I walked slowly, savoring the quiet, no longer haunted by what was, but curious about what could be. And for the first time in a long while, I wasn't looking back.